Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. A lot of good designs don't fail because they were bad ideas. They fail because they were only ever proven under local conditions. In one team, with one owner, with shared context, almost anything can look scalable. But the moment that same design touches the wider enterprise, the load changes, the interfaces multiply, and all the missing structure gets exposed at once. That's the scaling paradox. What looks like success in a pilot often becomes fragmentation in rollout. And if leaders miss that, they start copying solutions when what they actually need is aligned operating logic. Because organizations do not scale by repeating what worked once. They scale by reproducing the conditions that let trusted systems work everywhere. So let me take one step back and explain why scale changes the behavior of the whole system. Why scale changes the behavior of the system. The first thing we need to get clear is this. Scaling is not more of the same. That sounds obvious, but most rollout decisions still assume it is. We take a pilot that worked in one business unit, add more users, add more sites, add more workflows, add more departments, and call that scale. But from a structural point of view, that's not scale. That's load expansion without design adaptation. And why is that? Because as systems get bigger, their internal complexity grows faster than the organization's ability to coordinate it. A small team can run on trust, memory, and shortcuts. People know who owns what. They know where the data came from. They know which exception is normal and which one is risky. None of that is written down, but it works because the distance between people, decisions, and consequences is very small. At enterprise scale, that disappears. Now decisions travel across departments. Now access crosses boundaries. Now ownership is split. Now local workarounds become enterprise dependencies. This is where a useful metaphor helps. The square cube law comes from physics. If you scale an object up evenly, its volume grows faster than its surface area. In business terms, the inside grows faster than the interfaces that help manage it. You get more processes, more exceptions, more identities, more data paths, more environments, but your oversight, your coordination, and your shared understanding do not expand at the same rate. So the system feels heavier before anyone can explain why. That's why a pattern that feels efficient in a pilot often becomes fragile in a rollout. In the pilot, one person remembers the workaround. In the rollout, that workaround becomes undocumented policy. In the pilot, a shared mailbox or manual approval feels harmless. In the rollout, it becomes a hidden dependency across regions. In the pilot, a power app in the default environment solves a real problem fast. In the rollout, it creates support, security, and lifecycle questions nobody priced in. The thing most people miss is that local success hides structural debt. It hides it because the people closest to the solution are doing constant invisible compensation. They answer questions informally, they fix broken permissions quickly, they explain confusing data by context, they know which flow to ignore and which owner to call. So the system appears simple. It isn't simple. It's being held together by proximity, and proximity does not scale. Once you move from a team to a business unit or from one country to a global tenant, the hidden supports start dropping away. You can't rely on memory. You can't rely on trust alone. You can't rely on one talented person holding the model together. That's a single point of failure. And at enterprise scale, single points of failure don't stay local for long. They multiply. This is also why leaders often misread resistance during scale. They think the problem is cultural. They think teams are protecting turf, or middle management is slowing things down, or users just need more training. Sometimes that's part of it, but often the deeper issue is simpler. The system has exceeded the capacity it was designed to carry. That is not a motivation problem first. It's a capacity design problem. And capacity here does not just mean technical throughput. It means the ability of the organization to absorb more usage without losing coherence. Can it make decisions consistently? Can it assign ownership clearly? Can it trace data back to source? Can it provision access without creating drift? Can it support exceptions without redesigning the system every time? If the answer is no, scale changes the behavior of the system whether leadership sees it or not. The system starts compensating. More approvals, more cleanup, more naming rules, more tickets, more local exceptions, more shadow work. That's not maturity. Most of the time, it's structural compensation arriving late. And once that happens, the enterprise starts paying twice. Once for the original rollout, and again for the controls, support layers, and remediation needed to stop success from spreading chaos. So if you remember nothing else from this part, remember this. A pilot proves usefulness. It does not prove scalability. Scalability only exists when the surrounding operating model can carry the solution under heavier load, across more boundaries with less shared context, and still produce trusted outcomes. Once we see that, the pilot to platform gap starts to make sense. The pilot that worked and the rollout that failed. Let me make this concrete, because this is where a lot of leaders get trapped by the wrong signal. Picture a business unit with a real operational problem. Requests are coming in through email. Status is tracked in spreadsheets. Approvals are inconsistent. Nobody has a reliable view of what is open, what is blocked, or who owns the next move. So one capable team builds a solution inside Microsoft 365 and Power Platform. A SharePoint list becomes the working record. A Power App gives people one front door. A few Power Automate flows handle routing, reminders, and approvals. A team wraps collaboration around it, and it works. Cycle time drops. Visibility improves. People stop chasing updates manually. Leadership sees a clean before and after story, and that story is seductive because it looks like proof. We solved the problem, therefore we should scale it. But here's the thing. What actually made that pilot work was not just the app or the flow or the list, it was the environment around it. The scope was narrow. The owner was clear. The exceptions were limited. The decision path was short. The data was mostly understood. And the people involved had enough shared context to close gaps without formal process. That last part matters more than most rollout plans admit. When a user had an issue, they knew who to call. When a field name was confusing, someone explained it. When an approval route broke, the builder fixed it the same day. When data quality was messy, the team interpreted the result together. So the solution looked robust, but a lot of its resilience was still human, local, and informal. Now map that to the enterprise rollout. A second department wants the same thing. Then a third. Then another region asks for a localized version. Security asks for review. Compliance asks about retention. Architecture asks where the data belongs long-term. Support asks who owns incidents. Identity asks how access should work for guests, contractors, and internal moves. And suddenly the same solution is moving through a very different environment. Now there are more teams, more exceptions, more approvers, more integration questions, more edge cases, and far less shared context. This is where leaders often say we just need governance now. But in most failed rollouts, governance arrives as structural compensation, not as part of the original design. It shows up after the fact once the cracks are visible. So new approval layers get added. Naming rules get documented. Environment restrictions appear, creation rights get tightened, support queues are introduced, review boards get scheduled. All of that looks responsible. Sometimes it is necessary. But if those controls were not designed into the operating model from the start, they usually land as friction, and friction changes behavior. Local teams stop waiting. They copy the solution. They export data. They create side lists. They build a new flow in a nearby environment. They keep the visible interface, but the operating logic starts drifting underneath it. This is the point where adoption looks slower. But complexity is actually growing faster. The original team starts getting pulled into questions from everywhere. Can we add one more field? Can we bypass this approval? Can our business unit own our own version? Can this connect to another system? Can we move this into another environment without changing anything? And because the early success created trust, people assume the answer should be yes. That's the paradox again. Success creates demand. Demand exposes capacity limits. And then the organization blames the solution for failing under conditions it was never built to carry. I've seen this pattern many times. The language changes, the tools vary a bit, but the structural behavior stays the same. One local team solves something real. The result gets attention. Leadership wants leverage. Rollout starts before ownership, lifecycle, support, and decision rights are fully defined. Then rollout slows, duplicate versions appear, confidence drops, and everyone starts asking why something so promising became so hard. The answer is usually not that the pilot was wrong. It's that the surrounding system was never built to carry it at enterprise load. The solution did not fail. The enterprise context exposed what had been missing all along. And why is that? Because most rollouts confuse replication with scaling. Replication is not scaling. Replication is not scaling. This is where the language starts misleading people. Because replication feels like progress. You copy the app, you export the flow, you reuse the site template, you clone the environment pattern, you publish the governance deck. From the outside, it looks like scale is happening. Assets are moving. More teams are using the same things. The platform looks more standardized. But if you look closely, most of that is artifact replication, not system scaling. And that difference matters. Replication is about copying outputs. Scaling is about reproducing operating conditions. Those are not the same thing. An app can be copied in minutes. A workflow can be imported. A team structure can be templated. Even a policy pack can be rolled out quickly. But none of that guarantees that decisions will be made the same way, that ownership will be understood the same way, or that exceptions will be handled with the same logic across the enterprise. So what gets copied is the visible layer. What does not get copied is usually the invisible layer that made the original thing trustworthy. The reason this matters so much in Microsoft 365 and Power Platform is that the tools are very good at making replication easy. That is part of their value. We can move fast. We can package solutions. We can templatize collaboration spaces. We can automate provisioning. We can give many teams access to the same patterns. That is useful. But usefulness creates a trap. Because the easier it becomes to copy the artifact, the easier it is to ignore the operating model underneath it. So one business unit sees a successful intake app and wants it too. Another team takes the same flow and adapts the routing logic. Another region uses the same SharePoint structure but changes metadata to fit local reporting. Another environment imports the solution but reconnects it with different credentials, different data sources, and different support assumptions. Now everything still looks aligned on the surface. Same platform, same templates, same naming, same story in the steering committee. But underneath, the system is already drifting. And why is that? Because tool consistency is not operating consistency. If one team treats ownership as a business lead decision, another treats it as IT support, and another leaves it informal, then the same app will behave differently in each context over time. If one department has clear access review rules and another manages permissions ad hoc, then the same workspace model produces very different risk. If one region escalates exceptions through architecture and another resolves them through local admins, then the same standard becomes multiple systems wearing one interface. This is why standardizing the visible layer is not enough. It creates the appearance of coherence without guaranteeing coherence itself. And that appearance is dangerous because leadership often rewards visible rollout. How many solutions were deployed? How many teams were onboarded? How many processes were digitized? How many environments adopted the standard template? Those metrics are easy to show. They look like momentum, but they often hide whether the enterprise is actually becoming more aligned or just more uniformly fragmented. That's the thing most people miss. You can standardize the tool and still decentralize the logic. You can have one platform and many operating models. You can have one policy library and no shared enforcement. You can have one architecture diagram and 5 different interpretations of who decides what. From a system perspective, that's not maturity. It's drift with branding. And once that drift spreads, the organization starts paying a coordination tax everywhere. More clarification meetings, more exception handling, more duplicate support paths, more rework during audits, more time spent translating one team's version of the standard into another team's reality. This is where transformation programs often lose the plot. They mistake rollout for alignment. They assume that if enough teams are using the same Microsoft 365 services or the same Power Platform components, then enterprise scale has been achieved. But scale is not sameness at the interface. It is predictability in how the organization operates behind the interface. So if you want to know whether you are scaling or just replicating, ask different questions. Not how many teams use it. Ask, are decision rights clear everywhere? Not how many apps were deployed. Ask, can ownership survive staff changes? Not, did we publish the standard? Ask, do exceptions follow one trusted path? That's the real test. Because once you see the difference between copying artifacts and scaling operating logic, the first visible symptom becomes obvious. It usually shows up in the collaboration layer first. And that's where Tenant and workspace sprawl starts to tell the truth. Failure mode 1. Tenant and workspace sprawl. The first visible failure mode is usually sprawl. And in Microsoft 365, sprawl is not just a messy screen full of teams and sites nobody cleans up. That's the shallow version. The real issue is that collaboration surfaces multiply automatically, and every new surface carries permissions, ownership questions, data exposure, lifecycle cost, and support responsibility with it. That's the structural part most people underestimate. Create a team, and you're not just creating a chat space. You are also triggering a wider collaboration footprint around groups, files, access paths, and shared context. Do that at enterprise scale across departments, projects, regions, and vendors, and the number of collaboration objects starts growing faster than anyone can review, govern, or retire them. So what looks like flexibility becomes fragmentation. And why is that? Because unrestricted creation is incredibly efficient locally. A team needs a space, they create it. A project starts, they spin one up. A department can't find the right channel, so it creates another workspace. No ticket, no wait, no friction. At small scale, this feels modern, it feels empowering, and sometimes it is. But once that behavior spreads across the enterprise, the organization is effectively creating collaboration infrastructure without lifecycle logic. That is not self-service. It's unmanaged capacity growth. The signals are usually easy to spot once you know where to look. Duplicate teams with nearly identical names, SharePoint sites no one can confidently classify, private channels that outlive the business reason they were created for, groups with no active owner, workspaces with one burst of activity and then silence, assets still technically alive but operationally abandoned. And here's where most people mess up. They treat that as a cleanup issue. It's bigger than cleanup. Because clutter is only the visible symptom. Underneath it, sprawl creates 3 deeper problems. First, it increases search cost. People stop trusting that the right workspace is easy to find, so they ask around, search manually, or just make a new one. That means collaboration slows down before anyone logs a formal incident. Decision quality drops because the cost of finding context goes up. Second, it weakens ownership. If no one knows who is responsible for a team, a site, or a group, then no one really owns access reviews, lifecycle decisions, content quality, or retirement. The workspace remains active in technical terms but leaderless in operating terms. That's a single point of failure disguised as shared collaboration. Third, it expands risk silently. Old guest access remains. Permissions drift. Sensitive files stay in places no one actively governs. And because each new team or site extends the authorization graph of the tenant, sprawl becomes a security and compliance issue long before it becomes an aesthetic problem. This is why I don't like the word clutter here. Clutter sounds harmless. Sprawl is an authorization and ownership problem. Now map that to business reality. If your collaboration layer is fragmented, then people spend more time confirming where work should happen than actually moving work forward. If owners are unclear, support queues rise because nobody can resolve exceptions quickly. If lifecycle is missing, storage grows, audit work gets slower, and compliance exposure increases because nobody can say with confidence what should still exist and why. So the cost is not just technical, it is operational drag. And the reason this gets worse at scale is simple. Creation is fast, cleanup is slow, review is slower. Retirement is emotionally harder than creation because every workspace might still matter to someone, somewhere maybe. So the default becomes keep it. And when keep it becomes the default across a large tenant, fragmentation compounds. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It makes collaboration easy to start. It's just not enough to make collaboration governable at enterprise load unless creation is tied to ownership, classification, and lifecycle from the beginning. That is the shift leaders need to make. Do not ask only who can create. Ask what gets created with it. Ask who owns it after the excitement is gone. Ask how it will be reviewed, renewed, archived, or retired. Because if creation is not tied to lifecycle, value, and fragmentation grow together, and fragmentation usually grows faster. Once the collaboration layer spreads like that, the next fracture appears underneath it. The data layer starts breaking apart with it. Failure mode 2, data lineage gaps. Once the collaboration layer spreads, the next failure is usually less visible and far more dangerous. Data lineage starts breaking down, and this is where a lot of enterprise systems lose trust without anyone saying it out loud at first. Because locally, teams optimize for usefulness. They need the answer fast. They need a report that helps today. They need a list that works for the process in front of them. So they export data, copy records into another list, shape a spreadsheet for a meeting, build a flow that moves fields from one place to another, or create a side dataset because the original source is too slow, too messy, or too hard to access. In a pilot, that can feel efficient. In an enterprise, it becomes drift in the decision layer. The reason is simple. The moment data starts moving without shared lineage, you no longer have one truth traveling through the system. You have multiple local truths being interpreted as if they were equivalent. That is not the same thing. A list copied into Teams for convenience is not the same as the system of record. A spreadsheet extracted for reporting is not the same as governed operational data. A Power BI report built on manually shaped exports is not the same as a trusted enterprise view, even if the chart looks clean. And once those distinctions blur, confidence starts eroding before accuracy is even formally challenged. This is the part most people miss. Data trust usually collapses socially before it collapses technically. People start asking quiet questions. Where did this number come from? Why is finance seeing a different count than operations? Why does the dashboard not match what the team sees in the app? Why did last month's report change after refresh? Those questions are not small. They are signals that lineage has already weakened. And why does this get worse at scale? Because local teams are rewarded for usefulness, not for traceability. If a department solves its reporting problem with an export and a manual cleanup step, it gets praised for speed. If a team creates a side list because the source process is too hard to change, it gets praised for initiative. If a workflow copies data across systems so people can keep moving, it looks like enablement. But every one of those moves can create another break in lineage if origin, transformation, ownership, and refresh logic are not visible. So now decisions have to travel across functions on top of data that no longer has one reliable chain of custody. That slows everything. Not just because numbers differ, but because interpretation starts replacing trust. And when interpretation becomes the operating model, scale gets expensive fast. Meetings get longer because teams compare versions. Approvals get slower because leaders want manual confirmation. Audit work increases because reporting has to be reconstructed after the fact. And executives start getting dashboards that look precise but require negotiation every time something important is on the line. From a system perspective, that's not a data quality issue alone. It's a decision architecture issue. Because no single source of truth means no scalable decision-making. That means decisions are made through reconciliation. Now add AI to that picture. This is where a lot of organizations make the wrong assumption. They think Copilot, agents, or smarter automation will somehow clean up weak lineage by making information easier to access. But AI does not solve messy lineage. It surfaces it faster. It can also amplify it. If the underlying permissions are uneven, if content is duplicated, if labels are missing, if reports are built on inconsistent sources, then AI can generate answers that feel fluent while still resting on fractured foundations. That is not intelligence. It is speed applied to ambiguity. And in business reality, that can be worse than slow manual work because the answer arrives with confidence before the organization has earned confidence in the source. So what should leaders watch for? Different teams using the same words for different data sets, reports that can't be traced cleanly back to source, automations that copy records between lists or workspaces without clear ownership, spreadsheets that become informal systems of record, dashboards that trigger debate before action. Those are lineage signals. And once they appear, decision velocity starts dropping even if adoption still looks healthy. Because when leaders cannot trust where the answer came from, they stop trusting the answer. And once that trust weakens, the next failure usually shows up right beside it. Even when the data exists, the question becomes much more basic. Who actually owns it? Failure mode 3, role and ownership ambiguity. And this is where the next failure usually shows up. Even if the data exists, even if the workspace is still active, even if the app technically works, the enterprise starts losing speed because nobody can answer one simple question with confidence. Who owns what? Now that sounds basic. But at scale, ownership is one of the first things to become fuzzy while everyone still believes it is clear. A local team often says we all own it, or the business owns the process and IT owns the platform. Or support handles issues and the maker handles changes. Those statements sound reasonable, they sound collaborative, but once load increases, shared language often hides split accountability. And that matters because systems do not operate on good intentions, they operate on clear decision paths. If ownership is unclear, every exception becomes slower, every change becomes a negotiation, every incident starts with a routing exercise instead of a response. And this is why I treat unclear ownership as a structural issue, not a soft people issue. Because if you look closely, role ambiguity creates handoff friction across at least 5 layers. The data owner, the process owner, the app owner, the security owner, the support owner. In a healthy operating model, those roles may sit in different places, but the boundaries between them are visible. People know who decides what, who approves what, who responds when something breaks, and who carries risk when a change affects the wider environment. In an unhealthy model, those roles are blurred, assumed, or person-dependent. And then the same pattern appears everywhere. Approvals get duplicated because nobody is sure whose sign-off is enough. Changes get delayed because one team thinks another team owns the impact. Security concerns linger because platform admins can see the configuration but not the business intent. Support tickets bounce because the help desk can identify the symptom but not the accountable owner. And local experts become silent infrastructure because everyone knows they are the real answer path, even if no document says so. That last one is dangerous because from a system perspective, informal ownership is just a single point of failure with good manners. It feels fine while the person is available. It fails the moment they leave, change roles, go on holiday, or stop compensating for the system around them. I've seen this many times in Microsoft 365 and Power Platform estates. A flow is technically owned by a service account, functionally understood by one business analyst, operationally touched by support, and security reviewed by someone who never sees the daily process. On paper, the organization says the solution is managed. In practice, nobody owns the full outcome end to end. So when something changes, a connector, a permission, a policy, a field, an approval path, the organization does not execute a decision. It starts a search. Who built this? Who approved this? Who can change this? Who carries the risk? That search is the real cost of ownership ambiguity, not just confusion delay. And delay compounds fast at enterprise scale because ambiguity multiplies coordination load. Every unclear role creates more meetings, more copied emails, more escalation, more defensive behavior, and more local workarounds to avoid waiting for answers. So even when the platform is technically stable, the operating model becomes slow and expensive. This is why I'm skeptical when people say shared responsibility as if that solves the problem by itself. Shared responsibility can be mature, but only if accountability is still named. Without that, shared responsibility often means shared access and fragmented accountability. And those are very different things. So what should leaders watch for? Repeated escalation loops, change requests that stall between teams, critical assets with no confidently named owner, support that depends on knowing the right person, approvals that multiply instead of clarify. Those are not admin problems. They are signs that accountability has not scaled with the system. And the business impact is predictable. Slower execution, more rework, higher operational risk, lower trust in the platform. Because if nobody can say who owns the outcome, people stop trusting that the outcome will stay stable. And once ownership gets blurry, the environment layer starts absorbing that confusion. That's where Power Platform chaos usually begins. Failure mode 4, environment chaos in Power Platform. Once ownership gets blurry, the environment layer starts absorbing the confusion. And this is where Power Platform starts telling the truth about the organization around it. Because environment growth is rarely just a technical pattern. Most of the time, it is an operating model pattern made visible. If you see too many environments, too many unclear promotion paths, too many local exceptions, or too much use of the default environment, what you are really seeing is unresolved organizational ambiguity expressed as platform structure. That is why environment chaos matters. It is not just admin clutter. It is business confusion with technical consequences. In a small setup, people can get away with almost anything. A maker builds quickly in the default environment. A department creates a sandbox because waiting feels slower than doing. Someone connects directly to a local data source because it solves the immediate problem. And for a while, that works. The solution runs. Users are happy. Leadership sees movement. But once that same behavior spreads across multiple teams, regions, and functions, the platform starts carrying logic that was never designed to travel well. Now, one team treats environments as life cycle stages. Another uses them as department boundaries. Another uses them as permission workarounds. Another uses them because nobody trusts the shared process. So the environment model stops reflecting architecture and starts reflecting negotiation. That is the failure. Because environments are supposed to create repeatability. They are supposed to support separation between development, testing, and production. They are supposed to make change safer, support clearer controls, and reduce deployment risk. But when the operating logic around them is weak, environments become containers for local compensation. This is where most people miss the real issue. Low-code does not remove architecture. It redistributes architecture into places people stop looking. Instead of one formal design review, you get many silent design decisions. Which environment do we build in? Who can deploy? How do connections get recreated? What happens when the owner leaves? Which solution is managed? What gets promoted and what gets rebuilt manually? Those are architecture questions, even if they are asked by makers, admins, or support teams instead of enterprise architects. And if they are answered differently in different parts of the organization, you do not have one platform. You have multiple operating models sharing a logo. The signals show up fast. Heavy use of the default environment for work that should never live there long term. Sandboxes that quietly become production. Solutions moved between environments without disciplined ALM. Apps with hard-coded assumptions that break when promoted. Inconsistent connector policies. Manual deployment steps that only one person remembers. Support teams unable to tell which version is live and why. That last one is a major warning sign. Because when promotion logic is weak, trust in change starts collapsing. Teams stop believing that a clean move from dev to test to production is normal. So they compensate again, they rebuild, they patch in place, they skip steps, they ask for special treatment. And every exception teaches the organization that the platform is flexible but not predictable. That is not scale, that is drift under pressure. And the business impact is always larger than it first appears. Support burden rises because every environment carries its own assumptions. User experience becomes inconsistent because similar solutions behave differently across teams. Security risk increases because access, connectors, and data boundaries vary more than leaders realize. Deployment risk grows because repeatability is weak and rollback is often unclear. And the platform team gets trapped in reactive governance, trying to control after the fact what should have been made explicit earlier. This is why I look at environment count very differently from most dashboards. Too many environments relative to business value delivered is not just a growth signal. It is often a structural warning. It suggests the organization is solving ambiguity by creating more containers instead of clarifying decision logic. More places to build, more places to isolate, more places to delay the harder conversation. Who owns this? What pattern is standard? What must be reusable? What must be promoted through one trusted path? If those answers stay vague, environment growth becomes a substitute for architecture. And that gets expensive because the platform remains easy to start in but hard to support, govern, and trust at scale. So if you remember one thing here, remember this. Environment chaos is rarely caused by the platform alone. It is usually the organizational model leaking into the platform without enough structure to hold it. And once that happens, one more hidden layer starts forming underneath everything else. The unofficial connections, the undocumented automations, the dependencies nobody meant to turn into infrastructure. Failure mode 5, shadow connectors and hidden integrations. And then we get to the layer that usually stays invisible until something breaks. Shadow connectors and hidden integrations. This is where local convenience becomes enterprise fragility very quickly, because unofficial connections are often created by good people solving real problems at speed. A team needs data from another system, so someone adds a connector. A workflow needs to keep moving, so a shared credential gets reused. A reporting gap appears, so exports start feeding another list, another mailbox, another automation. None of that feels dramatic in the moment. It feels useful. That is exactly why it is dangerous. The most risky complexity is usually the complexity that works. If a bad idea fails immediately, the organization notices. If an unofficial integration quietly delivers value for 6 months, It starts becoming infrastructure without ever being treated like infrastructure. And why is that? Because hidden integrations are usually born in the gap between demand and formal capacity. The business needs something now. The official roadmap is too slow. The support model is unclear. The architecture path feels heavy. So a maker, an analyst, or a local admin builds a bridge. One connector here, one scheduled export there, one service account shared across a few automations, one API call nobody documents because the immediate goal is speed, not lineage, not supportability, not enterprise resilience. From a local point of view, that makes sense. From an enterprise point of view, it creates dependencies that nobody is governing as a whole. This is the part most people miss. A connector is not just a connector, it is a trust relationship. It defines what can talk to what. It carries identity, permissions, data movement, and failure behavior with it. So when those relationships multiply outside a visible operating model, the platform starts accumulating hidden parts that no one can fully see, review, or retire safely. That is when useful turns fragile. You see it in patterns like this. Flows running on shared credentials, unofficial APIs used because the approved integration path takes too long. Mailboxes forwarding data between systems informally, exports feeding spreadsheets that trigger downstream reporting, service accounts surviving role changes because too many things now depend on them, custom connectors built for one use case and quietly reused by 5 others. All of this creates silent coupling, and silent coupling is what makes incidents spread, because the failure rarely happens where leaders expect it. A policy changes, a connector gets restricted, a password rotates, an owner leaves, a service principal gets cleaned up, a licensing change lands, and suddenly a process in another part of the organization stops working, not because that team changed anything, but because their stability was resting on an invisible dependency upstream. That is incident amplification, one small break, many downstream effects, slow diagnosis, delayed recovery. And usually a lot of executive frustration because the problem feels mysterious. But it is not mysterious. It is undocumented usefulness catching up with the enterprise. And this is why I keep coming back to the phrase structural resilience. If a business-critical process depends on a connection nobody reviews, a credential nobody owns clearly, or an automation nobody can trace end-to-end, then the organization has built value on top of a weak support structure. From a system perspective, that is not agility. It is concentration risk. A single point of failure can be technical. It can also be relational. One person knows the logic. One account powers the flow. One exception keeps the bridge alive. That is enough to make the system look stable right until it isn't. So what should leaders watch for? Integrations without named owners. Automations tied to personal or shared accounts. Processes that break when specific people leave. Connectors no one can classify by criticality. Data movement that exists in practice but not in architecture records. Those are not edge cases. They are early warnings that the enterprise has started scaling convenience instead of supportable design. And the business impact is always bigger than the connector itself. Compliance gaps widen because data moves through unofficial routes. Recovery takes longer because nobody has a full dependency map. Support costs rise because mystery failures consume senior attention. Trust drops because users experience instability with no clear explanation. So the core insight here is simple. Complexity is most dangerous when it is useful and undocumented. That is the pattern. 5 visible symptoms. One structural issue underneath all of them. The real root cause, capacity does not scale automatically. So now we have the pattern. Workspace sprawl, lineage gaps, ownership ambiguity, environment chaos, hidden integrations, 5 different symptoms. But if you look closely, they are not 5 separate problems. They are one structural problem expressing itself through different layers of the platform. Capacity did not scale with demand. That is the root cause. And I want to slow down on that because this is where a lot of organizations make a very expensive mistake. They assume that if a solution proves useful, the organization around it will somehow stretch to carry it. More users come in, more teams adopt it, more workflows get added. The business value is real, so leadership assumes capacity will catch up later. It usually doesn't, not on its own. Because organizational capacity is not an automatic byproduct of success. It has to be built deliberately. And in enterprise Microsoft 365 and Power Platform estates, that capacity is not just technical scale, it is operating scale. Can the organization govern creation before sprawl shows up? Can it assign ownership before key people become hidden infrastructure? Can it manage lineage before reporting becomes negotiation? Can it review access before AI or automation starts surfacing the mess faster? Can it support environments, connectors, and exceptions without reinventing the model every time demand increases? That is capacity. And why is that so often missed? Because demand is visible and capability is not. Leaders can see usage numbers. They can see adoption graphs. They can see success stories from business units. They can see pressure from other teams asking for the same thing. But governance capacity, lifecycle discipline, support readiness, architecture clarity, and decision logic, those are much less visible in the short term. They look like overhead right up until the moment their absence starts slowing everything down. So the organization funds demand first. Licenses, projects, use cases, rollout waves. And capability gets treated as something to tighten later. That delay is where fragmentation enters. Because the platform keeps expanding while the operating model stays thin. which means every new success lands on the same unresolved questions. Who owns this? Where should it live? How does it move to production? What data can it trust? How is access reviewed? What happens when it breaks? If those questions are still being answered ad hoc at scale, then the enterprise is not scaling a platform. It is scaling uncertainty. That sounds harsh, but from a system perspective, that's exactly what is happening. The organization is increasing load without increasing coherence, and systems under that kind of pressure do what they always do. They compensate. People create local workarounds. Admins add approval steps. Platform teams introduce restrictions after incidents. Support absorbs ambiguity manually. Architecture gets pulled in late to clean up what should have been decided earlier. Again, that is not maturity by itself. A lot of it is delayed capacity trying to catch a moving target. This is why scaling success can actually guarantee failure if capacity is not scaled with it. The better the early result, the faster demand spreads. The faster demand spreads, the more hidden weaknesses get multiplied through adoption. So ironically, success can destabilize the enterprise faster than failure would have. Failure stops momentum. Success accelerates load. If the structure underneath is underbuilt, success is the more dangerous event. That is the scaling paradox in its cleanest form. And this is not anti-growth, it is pro-structural resilience. I am not arguing for slower ambition, I'm arguing for matched expansion. If you want more solutions, you need more operating clarity. If you want more makers, you need more lifecycle logic. If you want more automation, you need more ownership discipline. If you want more AI, you need more trust in permissions, lineage, and policy enforcement. Because capacity does not scale automatically, usefulness does not create governance, adoption does not create accountability. More demand does not produce more coherence by itself. Those things have to be designed, and once leaders really see that, the next mistake becomes obvious too. They try to fix the problem by controlling everything. The governance trap, more control, less scale. But here's where most people mess up. They finally see the fragmentation, the duplicate workspaces, the unclear ownership, the hidden flows, the broken promotion paths, and they respond with more control everywhere at once. More approvals, more gates, more tickets, more exception reviews. More central sign-off for every change, every team, every environment, every connector, every request. That response feels responsible. It also often makes the system worse. And why is that? Because reactive governance usually treats visible symptoms as if they were root causes. If teams are multiplying, restrict creation. If flows are spreading, require approval. If environments are messy, lock them down. If data is drifting, centralize every reporting decision. None of those moves are automatically wrong. Some are necessary, but when they arrive late without fixing the operating gaps underneath, they create a very predictable result. Less scale. The organization slows down, but it does not actually become more coherent. This is the governance trap. Leaders believe they are regaining control, when in reality, they are often converting unmanaged complexity into managed delay. That distinction matters because if your real problem is missing ownership, adding more approval does not create ownership. If your real problem is weak lifecycle logic, adding more intake forms does not create lifecycle. If your real problem is unclear decision rights, routing every exception through a central team does not create clarity. It creates a queue, and queues are where scale goes to die. I've seen this pattern in enterprise Microsoft 365 and Power Platform programs many times. A successful wave creates spread. Spread creates drift. Drift creates concern. Concern triggers governance hardening. Suddenly every new team needs approval. Every environment request goes through a committee. Every connector conversation becomes a risk review. Every maker has to wait for a central function that is already overloaded. The visible effect is tighter control. The structural effect is something else. Teams start going around the process, not because they are reckless, because the business need did not disappear when the ticket queue appeared. So shadow behavior rises. People keep using local files. They build outside the preferred pattern. They delay registration. They use what is already available instead of what is governed. That is not a people failure first. It is a system outcome. The system is teaching people that the sanctioned path is too slow for the demand it is meant to support. And once that lesson spreads, trust in governance drops fast. Governance stops being seen as an enabling structure and starts being experienced as a brake. That is when central teams get blamed for blocking innovation, even if the deeper problem is that the organization waited too long to build scalable controls. So let me make the distinction very plain. Too little governance creates chaos. Too much reactive governance creates avoidance. Neither one scales. What scales is governance that is built into the operating model early enough that it feels like infrastructure, not interruption. That means guardrails that shape behavior before sprawl appears. Clear ownership before incidents expose the gap. Environment rules before every team invents its own promotion logic. Lifecycle expectations attached to creation itself. access models that are simple enough to apply consistently without a negotiation every time. That kind of governance does not slow scale. It makes trusted scale possible. From a system perspective, governance should reduce decision friction, not multiply it. It should remove ambiguity from repeatable cases and reserve escalation for the few situations that are genuinely exceptional. If everything needs special review, the organization has not built governance, it has built dependence on gatekeepers. That is fragile. It is also expensive because the central team becomes the new single point of failure. And once that happens, every scaling conversation starts sounding the same. We need more governance. What people usually mean is we need more control. But control is not the same as coherence. You can centralize approvals and still have weak ownership. You can lock down environments and still have broken lifecycle logic. You can restrict makers and still have unclear data lineage. That is why bad governance creates the illusion of safety while pushing complexity into less visible places. So the real belief break here is simple. Governance is not the break. Bad governance is. Good governance creates predictable operating boundaries that let many teams move safely without asking for permission every 5 minutes. It is not there to control every decision. It is there to make the right decisions repeatable. So the question is not whether you need consistency. The question is what kind of consistency actually scales. Tool consistency versus system consistency. So this is the distinction leaders need to get very clear on. You can standardize the tools and still fail to standardize the system. And in Microsoft 365 and Power Platform programs, that happens all the time. The tenant is consolidated. Teams is the standard collaboration layer. SharePoint is the document layer. Power Platform is the automation and app layer. Maybe there is even one approved environment strategy, one naming convention, one set of policy documents, one architecture board, one center of excellence. On paper, that looks like enterprise alignment, but business reality is decided underneath the tools. It is decided in how access is granted, how ownership is named, how exceptions are handled, how changes are promoted, how incidents are escalated, how data is trusted, how local variation is allowed without breaking enterprise coherence. That is system consistency. And if that layer is inconsistent, the same tooling produces different outcomes in different parts of the organization. That is the trap. Because tools are visible, operating logic is not. So executives often feel safer once the platform decision is made. We are on Microsoft 365, we are on Teams, we are on Power Platform. Good, but the platform does not remove organizational variance, it reveals it. One department creates workspaces through a managed request path. Another still creates them informally through whoever has rights. One business unit reviews access quarterly. Another assumes owners will remember. One team uses clear dev, test, and production separation. Another builds in one place and hopes nobody notices. One process has a named business owner and support path. Another depends on whoever built it first. Same platform, different system, different risk, different trust level. That is why same tool does not mean same operating model. And this matters more at scale because enterprise trust is cumulative. People do not ask whether the platform is theoretically capable. They ask whether outcomes are predictable. If they request access, will the process be clear? If something breaks, will the right owner respond? If a dashboard says something important, can they trust the lineage? If a new solution goes live, will support know what changed? That is what builds confidence. Not the logo, not the license agreement, not the architecture slide. Predictability builds trust. So when I talk about system consistency, I do not mean forcing identical process everywhere. That would be unrealistic and frankly fragile in its own way. Local teams do have different operational realities. A factory, a legal team, a regional sales unit, and a global shared service center do not need to work in exactly the same sequence just to satisfy architecture purity. That is not the goal. The goal is shared operating logic where enterprise coherence is at stake. What must be true everywhere for this environment to stay trustworthy? What ownership rules cannot change from one region to another? What access model has to remain consistent? What escalation path must exist for critical issues? What lifecycle expectations must be attached to creation every single time? Those are system questions. And once those answers are stable, local process variation becomes much safer because teams are adapting inside a trusted frame instead of redesigning the frame every time they need to move. This is the belief break many organizations need. Standardizing the interface is not the same as standardizing the system. You can have one collaboration suite and 5 different definitions of ownership. You can have one low-code platform and 10 different interpretations of what production means. You can have one governance model and multiple unwritten exception cultures operating underneath it. From a system perspective, that is not alignment. It is inconsistency hidden by common tooling. So if you are responsible for scale, stop asking only whether teams are using the approved tools. Ask whether they are making decisions through the same logic. Ask whether risk is being managed through the same boundaries. Ask whether support, ownership, access, and lifecycle would still hold if key people change tomorrow. Because that is the real scaling layer. System consistency is what allows local autonomy without enterprise drift. And once leaders understand that difference, the gap between controlled scale and uncontrolled scale becomes much easier to see. Case 1, the controlled scale. So now let's map that to the opposite pattern. Same kind of beginning. A local pilot works, a real problem gets solved. People see the time savings, the visibility, the cleaner handoffs, and leadership starts asking the same question as before. Can we scale this? But in the controlled scale story, the organization does something different very early. It does not start by copying the artifact. It starts by stabilizing the conditions around the artifact, and that changes everything. Before Rollout expands, decision rights are made explicit, not perfectly, not with a giant bureaucracy, just clearly enough that people know where business ownership ends, where platform responsibility begins, and how exceptions move when the default pattern no longer fits. That alone removes a huge amount of ambiguity. Then ownership gets named at the asset level, not vaguely, not as shared responsibility in a slide deck. Named. Who owns the process? Who owns the data? Who owns the solution lifecycle? Who owns support? Who owns security review? That does not mean one person does everything. It means the organization can follow a change or an incident to an accountable path without guessing. And why does that matter? Because scale is mostly a coordination problem before it becomes a technology problem. If people know how decisions move, the same platform can support much more variation without becoming unstable. The next thing the controlled scale organization does is constrain the environment model before demand explodes. It decides what environments are for. Development, test, production, maybe a limited pattern for department isolation where there is a real business reason. But the point is that environments are tied to operating logic, not to emotion, convenience, or local politics. So teams can still move, but they move inside known lanes. That is the difference. Then the data model gets attention earlier than most organizations expect. Not every field, not every report, but the core entities, the ownership of those entities, and the rule for what counts as a trusted source are clarified before 5 teams create 5 interpretations. That one decision protects a lot of downstream trust, because now local teams can extend the process without redefining the truth underneath it. Lifecycle rules are also built into creation. If a workspace is created, it has an owner. If a solution is promoted, it has a path. If an exception is granted, it has a review point. If an integration is introduced, it is visible. None of that feels exciting in a steering committee. But this is the quiet work that makes enterprise scale possible. And here's the part many leaders miss. The controlled scale story is not rigid. Local teams still adapt. They still change wording, sequence, handoff detail, reporting views, maybe even some workflow behavior to fit their operational context. But they are adapting within boundaries that preserve enterprise coherence. So the freedom is real. It is just not freedom to redesign the system every time a new team joins. That creates a very different result over time. Support becomes easier because patterns repeat. Architecture gets stronger because learning is reusable. Security reviews speed up because the shape of risk is more predictable. New teams onboard faster because they are joining a way of operating, not inventing one. And trust compounds because people start seeing that the platform behaves consistently even when local use cases differ. That is what controlled scale feels like. Not slow, not centralized in the worst sense, just structurally legible. The organization can explain how something gets created, changed, supported, reviewed, and retired without relying on heroics. And that lowers coordination cost everywhere. Fewer clarification meetings, fewer one-off approvals, fewer duplicate builds, fewer mystery failures. More confidence that what worked in one place can work somewhere else without being reinvented. So when I look at a controlled scale case, I do not think they scaled the app. I think they scaled the operating model around the app. That is the real win. Because the solution becomes portable only when the logic around it is portable too. And once that happens, learning starts compounding instead of fragmenting. One team discovers a better pattern. It can travel. One risk gets identified. It can be addressed once and reused broadly. One support issue reveals a weak boundary. That boundary can be strengthened for everyone. This is what enterprise maturity actually looks like. Not more tools, more repeatable logic around the tools. And when that logic is in place, scale stops feeling like a series of exceptions and starts feeling like a reliable expansion of capability. Case 2, the uncontrolled scale. Now map that to the opposite pattern. Same kind of beginning. A pilot works fast, people like it, leadership sees visible value, and demand starts coming in from everywhere. Other teams want the app, other departments want the workflow, other regions want the same reporting view. The energy looks healthy, it looks like momentum. And because the early success is real, nobody wants to slow it down with harder structural questions. So the rollout starts on enthusiasm. That is the first warning sign. Because in the uncontrolled scale story, demand becomes the operating model. Whoever asks loudest gets the next version. Whoever has influence gets the next environment. Whoever has a local exception gets the next workaround. Nothing feels irrational in isolation. Every decision can be defended. The business needs speed. The team is under pressure. The use case is slightly different. The rollout team wants to keep trust high, so it says yes again and again. And that's where the drift starts. Not with one dramatic mistake. With repeated local adaptation that never reconnects to one shared logic. One team changes the intake flow because their manager wants a different approval route. Another adds fields to the data structure to support local reporting. Another bypasses the standard environment path because they need production access faster. Another reconnects the solution with a different credential model because nobody wants to wait for the central team. Another builds side reporting because the enterprise source is not ready yet. Now, all of this still sounds manageable. Same app family, same platform, same transformation banner. But the organization is no longer expanding one model. It is accumulating many versions of what the model means. That difference is everything. Because once enough teams adapt the solution without shared operating boundaries, leadership starts losing the thing it thought it was scaling. Trustworthy repeatability. At first, the symptoms are easy to dismiss. Support requests take longer. Documentation falls behind. Environment inventories get harder to explain. Ownership names change depending on who is asked. Dashboards stop matching perfectly. People begin saying things like, "That's how this version works in our area." That phrase matters. Because the moment every area has its own version of the standard has stopped functioning as a system anchor. It has become a loose brand. Then governance arrives. Late and heavy. Usually after risk, confusion, or audit pressure becomes impossible to ignore. And because it arrives late, it does not feel like infrastructure. It feels like interruption. Approvals increase. Creation rights tighten. Environment requests pile up. Connector reviews slow everything down. Platform teams are asked to regain control over patterns they were never given the capacity to shape early enough. So adoption starts dropping at exactly the moment leadership expected scale to accelerate. That creates executive fatigue very quickly. Because now the story changes. What looked like a successful expansion starts generating the opposite signal. More cost, more inconsistency, more frustration, more debate about whether the platform itself is the problem. But the platform is usually not the problem. The surrounding operating model never became strong enough to carry success. And this is the brutal part of uncontrolled scale. Failure would have been cheaper. A failed pilot would have stayed local. An over-successful pilot spreads fast enough to create enterprise fragmentation before the organization has language for what is going wrong. So success becomes the accelerant, not because the idea was wrong, because the system around it stayed underbuilt while demand multiplied. That is why uncontrolled scale always feels confusing from the inside. People can point to real wins. They can point to actual adoption. They can point to visible business value in multiple places. And all of that can be true at the same time. The enterprise is becoming less coherent, more expensive to support, and harder to trust. From a system perspective, that is not contradiction. It is exactly what happens when local optimization outruns shared operating logic. So if you want one line to remember from this case, it is this. They did not lose control because they scaled too slowly. They lost control because they scaled demand faster than alignment. And once that happens, every new rollout wave adds more pressure to a model that is already fragmenting underneath the surface. Principle 1. Scale principles, not solutions. So if uncontrolled scale comes from copying too fast and aligning too little, the first design correction is simple. Scale principles, not solutions. This is one of the most important shifts leaders can make because most enterprise rollouts still start with the wrong question. They ask, how do we replicate this app, this workflow, this team structure, this environment setup, this reporting model? That sounds practical. It also locks the organization into artifact thinking. Artifacts matter. But artifacts are the last mile of scale, not the first. The first thing that has to travel is the operating logic underneath them. What must remain true everywhere for this to stay trustworthy? That is the real question. Because if you can answer that clearly, local solutions can vary without enterprise trust collapsing. If you cannot answer it, then every copied solution carries hidden assumptions that will break differently in every new context. So what kinds of principles actually matter? Decision rules matter. Who can decide what, at what level, with what kind of escalation when the default path no longer fits? Ownership rules matter. Every critical asset class needs named accountability, not just good intentions and shared visibility. Lifecycle rules matter. Creation, review, renewal, archive, retirement. If those are vague, scale turns into accumulation. Exception rules matter. Not just whether exceptions are allowed, but how they are documented, time-bound, and brought back into visibility. And trust rules matter. What is the authoritative source? What is a local copy? What is allowed to vary? What must remain stable for reporting, access, compliance, and support? Those are principles. They are portable because they shape behavior across many solutions without forcing every team into one rigid implementation. That is why principles scale better than templates alone. A template can help people start faster. A principle helps them make aligned decisions when reality gets messy. And reality always gets messy. Now, this does not mean principles should become abstract slogans. If a principle cannot guide a real decision, it is not doing enough work. Saying we value collaboration or we prioritize innovation is not useful when a team wants a new environment, a business unit wants a custom connector, or a regional process wants to break the shared data model. Scalable principles have to be operational. They should help people answer questions like these. Can this data be copied locally, or must it stay tied to the source? Can this solution go live without named support ownership? Can this workspace be created without a review path? Can this team change the process while keeping enterprise reporting intact? That is where principal design becomes business architecture, not just technical governance. And this is where enterprise architecture often needs to mature, because if architecture stays focused only on solution review, it shows up too late. By that point, the local design already exists, demand already exists, and the conversation becomes whether to approve an exception. But if architecture helps define the principles that shape decision-making upfront, it becomes much more useful. It moves from gatekeeping artifacts to stabilizing operating logic. That is a very different role, and a much more scalable one, because if leaders can define the few things that must remain true everywhere, teams gain freedom everywhere else. That is the balance. Not centralize every design choice, not allow every variation. Define the non-negotiables that protect enterprise coherence and let local execution adapt inside them. This clicked for me when I realized most rollout pain is not caused by bad local thinking. It is caused by local teams being forced to invent principles on the fly because the enterprise never made them visible. So every team answers the same questions differently and drift becomes inevitable. That is why the shortcut nobody teaches is this. Before you scale anything, write down the principles that make it safe to trust at enterprise load, not the feature list. Not the rollout schedule, the principles. Because once those are stable, solutions become portable for the right reason. Not because they are identical, because the logic that surrounds them is Principle 2, standardize what matters. Once principles are clear, the next move is where many organizations either become scalable or become rigid for no reason. They standardize the wrong things. And this happens because standardization feels safest when it is visible. Leaders can point to one naming convention, one screen layout, one approval form, one workspace template, one process map, and say, good, now we have consistency. But visible sameness is not always the kind of consistency that protects an enterprise. Sometimes it is just cosmetic control. What actually matters is standardizing the few things that preserve trust, supportability, and coherent decision-making across many teams. That means standardizing decision flow, how requests are evaluated, how exceptions are escalated, how ownership is assigned, how support is routed, how production changes are approved, how lifecycle review happens. Those things matter because they shape enterprise behavior long after the original rollout team is gone. Then standardize data ownership. Not every report design, not every local field label, but the rule for who owns critical entities, who can redefine them, and what source remains authoritative when local teams need flexibility around it. That protects decision trust. Then standardize access patterns. How privileged access is granted, how reviews happen, how external sharing is controlled, how service identities are handled. Because if access logic varies wildly, risk and trust vary wildly too, even when the tools stay the same. And then standardize environment boundaries. What counts as development, what counts as test, what counts as production, what can live in the default environment temporarily and what cannot. What promotion path is expected. What kind of solution requires managed lifecycle discipline. Those are the controls that preserve coherence. They do not remove local movement. They make local movement safer. Now here is the trap to avoid. Do not begin by standardizing every workflow detail, every page layout, every naming preference, or every local process sequence. That usually creates friction without producing much structural value. A regional operations team may need a different approval order than a legal team. A field service group may need different language than a finance function. A local process may have genuine sequencing differences because the business context is different. That kind of variation is normal. Sometimes it is healthy. If you try to eliminate all of it, the organization starts fighting the standard instead of trusting it. So the discipline is this: standardize what affects enterprise coherence. Leave room where local context creates real value. That sounds simple, but it requires much better judgment than most governance models use. Because this is not a debate between centralization and freedom. It is a design question about where variation is cheap and where variation is dangerous. Variation in button labels is usually cheap. Variation in ownership rules is dangerous. Variation in local task order may be cheap. Variation in access review logic is dangerous. Variation in report formatting may be cheap. Variation in data definitions is dangerous. That is the lens. And once you use that lens, governance gets much sharper. Instead of trying to control everything, the enterprise starts protecting the few controls that carry disproportionate risk if they drift. That is structural resilience. A small number of strong shared controls. A larger space for safe local adaptation around them. The business payoff is significant. Auditability improves because critical decisions follow repeatable paths. Support cost drops because operating patterns repeat. Rollout speed actually increases because teams are not renegotiating the same foundational questions every time. And hidden exceptions reduce because the sanctioned path starts making more sense than the workaround. This is where standardization becomes enabling instead of restrictive. Not because people love standards, because the right standards remove friction from the parts of work that should not require reinvention. So if you are leading scale, ask a harder question than, where should we standardize? Ask this instead. Which few controls, if they differ across teams, will slowly break trust in the whole platform? Start there. Protect those first, and leave the rest flexible enough for the business to stay real. Because scale does not need uniformity everywhere. It needs coherence where coherence matters most. Principle 3. Allow local adaptation within boundaries. And this is the next place scale usually breaks. Organizations finally accept that they need principles. They standardize what matters, and then they swing too far in the other direction. They start treating alignment as if it means uniformity. Same process, same structure, same approval path, same wording, same sequence, same everything. From a system perspective, that is not strength, it is brittleness. Because enterprises are not one operating context, they are many contexts sharing a platform. A regional team, a plant, a legal function, a shared service center, and a sales organization do not experience work in the same order with the same language or under the same constraints. If you force all of that into one rigid operating pattern, you are not removing complexity. You are just pushing it into resistance, side behavior, and exception traffic. That is why local adaptation matters, not as a nice cultural gesture, as architecture. A scalable enterprise model has to tell people two things very clearly. Here is where you must stay aligned, and here is where you are free to adapt. Without both of those, scale turns unhealthy in one of two ways. Either teams invent their own local model and enterprise drift accelerates, or the center overdefines everything, local reality gets ignored, and people start working around the standard just to get the job done. Neither outcome is mature. What we want instead is bounded variation. That means local teams can adapt the parts of the process that are truly contextual. Language, task sequence, operational handoffs, role labels, regional workflow detail, maybe some reporting views, maybe specific approval steps that reflect regulatory or operational reality. Those are often legitimate differences. But the adaptation happens inside boundaries that protect the larger enterprise logic. The data source remains trustworthy. Ownership remains named. Access remains governable. Lifecycle remains visible. Support paths remain clear. Promotion rules remain intact. That is the frame. And why is that so important? Because freedom without boundaries creates divergence. But boundaries without freedom create structural compensation. People still need to solve real work. So if the official design does not fit reality, they will not stop needing reality. They will just solve it elsewhere, in spreadsheets, in unofficial flows, in side conversations, in manual workarounds, in exceptions that quietly become permanent. That is not non-compliance first. It is a design signal. The standard is too detached from the work it is supposed to support. So let me put this very plainly. Local adaptation is not the enemy of scale. Unbounded local adaptation is. And unworkable central uniformity is too. This is where good architecture earns its keep. It draws the line in the right place, not by asking, how do we make every team operate the same, but by asking, where is variation useful and where does variation become dangerous to enterprise trust? That question changes everything. Variation in terminology may be useful. Variation in who can approve production access is dangerous. Variation in task order may be useful. Variation in authoritative data definitions is dangerous. Variation in a local support intake step may be useful. Variation in lifecycle ownership is dangerous. So the real skill is not writing more standards, it is deciding which differences the enterprise can absorb safely. When that is done well, local teams stop fighting the platform because the platform stops pretending that all work is identical, and central teams stop drowning in exceptions because they are no longer trying to control every local detail. Both sides get something better: local relevance, enterprise coherence. That combination is what scale actually needs. I've seen this click when leaders stop designing for sameness and start designing for safe variation. They define the non-negotiables clearly, then make the adaptation space explicit. Teams know what they can change without creating risk. They know when a variation is acceptable and when it needs escalation. That removes a huge amount of friction because people are no longer guessing where freedom ends and enterprise responsibility begins. And once that line is visible, behavior improves fast. Fewer shadow fixes, fewer emotional debates about governance, fewer local redesigns pretending to be necessary when they are really just responses to ambiguity. More trust, more speed, more sustainable rollout. Because this is not compromise. It is architecture doing its real job. A scalable system does not eliminate local difference. It decides where difference is productive and where it becomes a threat to structural resilience. If you get that right, teams can move in ways that feel natural to them without slowly breaking the platform underneath everyone else. And once that is in place, the next thing that has to change is how leaders measure success at all. Principle 4, measure system health, not adoption. And once that boundary model is in place, leadership has to stop asking the easiest question. Are people using it? Because adoption by itself is a very weak signal. In fact, at enterprise scale, high adoption can hide serious structural weakness. A platform can be busy and still be fragile. A workflow can be popular and still depend on unclear ownership. A reporting layer can be heavily used and still be built on mistrusted lineage. A collaboration model can show massive activity while duplication, drift, and access risk keep spreading underneath it. That is why I always get cautious when adoption is presented as proof of maturity. Usage tells you something. It does not tell you enough. And why is that? Because people will adopt what helps them get work done, even if the surrounding structure is unhealthy. They will use the app, they will create the team, they will rely on the automation, they will open the dashboard. That behavior is rational, it reflects usefulness, but usefulness is not the same as enterprise stability. This is the same mistake we talked about earlier. Leaders mistake visible demand for scalable readiness. So the metric dashboard looks good. More active users, more apps, more flows, more workspaces, more requests fulfilled. And everybody feels like scale is happening. But if those numbers rise while duplication is increasing, if ownership is becoming harder to trace, if support effort is climbing, if exception handling is expanding, then the organization is not becoming healthier. It is just becoming busier. That distinction matters a lot, because if you measure adoption without measuring system health, you will reward the exact behavior that creates structural debt. Teams that launch quickly will look successful even if they leave behind orphaned assets, unclear support paths, and fragmented data logic. Platform leaders will be pushed to accelerate rollout even when the estate is becoming harder to govern. Executives will assume the transformation is working because the numbers keep moving up. Meanwhile, trust quietly starts moving down. So what should we measure instead? First, decision velocity. How long does it take for the organization to make and execute routine platform decisions without confusion, escalation, or rework? If every environment request, access change, or rollout variation turns into a long coordination exercise, that is not scale. That is friction hidden inside process. Second, duplication load. How many similar solutions, workspaces, or reports exist for the same business need? Because duplication is one of the clearest signs that teams no longer trust the shared path enough to reuse it. Third, ownership clarity. Can the organization name who owns the process, the data, the solution, and the support path without debate? If not, you are carrying operational risk whether adoption is high or low. Fourth, dependency load. How many critical processes rely on hidden connectors, person-dependent knowledge, shared credentials, or fragile exception paths? High dependency concentration is a structural warning, especially when the official architecture record does not reflect reality. And fifth, environment to solution ratio. How many environments are being created relative to real business value delivered? Because when environment growth outpaces reusable capability, it often means ambiguity is being absorbed into structure instead of resolved in design. Those are health metrics. They tell you whether the platform is stabilizing as it spreads. And then there are the leading indicators, which matter even more because they show stress before failure becomes visible, more private channels, more duplicate tools, more manual reconciliation between reports, more exceptions handled outside the normal path. More coordination effort just to keep standard operations moving. Those are not small annoyances. They are signs that the enterprise is compensating for weak design. This is where executive attention needs to mature. Stop asking only who is using it. Start asking, is the system becoming more trustworthy as usage grows? Is support getting easier or harder? Is reuse increasing or is reinvention spreading? Are decisions moving faster because the operating model is clear or slower because the organization is negotiating basics every time? Those questions give you a much better read on whether scale is real, because a healthy platform does not just attract activity, it reduces entropy, it lowers the cost of coordination, it makes outcomes more predictable. That is what leaders should be watching. And once you start measuring health instead of popularity, one more uncomfortable truth becomes very visible. What the organization funds usually has very little to do with what the system actually needs. Why funding models break scaling. And this is where the organization usually reveals what it actually believes, not in the strategy deck, not in the steering committee language, in the funding model. Because most enterprises still fund visible solutions far more easily than they fund invisible capability. An app gets approved because it has a business sponsor, a timeline, a team, and a story. A workflow gets approved because it saves hours. A rollout gets approved because leaders can point to adoption, productivity, and quick wins. All of that is understandable. But scale does not fail because solutions exist. It fails because the surrounding capability was never funded strongly enough to carry them. That is the financial version of the scaling paradox. The money follows delivery. The real need is operating capacity. And why does that gap happen so consistently? Because solutions are easy to package. You can name them, demo them, scope them, put milestones around them, show a before and after. Capability is harder. Governance capacity does not make a flashy screenshot. Architecture time does not look like a product launch. Lifecycle controls do not feel exciting in a quarterly update. Enablement, support readiness, inventory discipline, ownership models, observability, access reviews, those things look like overhead when the organization is still emotionally attached to speed. So they get underfunded, then the rollout succeeds, then demand spreads, then the hidden cost appears. Now the central team needs more support people. More governance time, more architecture review, more environment administration, more identity and access discipline, more platform operations, more training for makers and owners, more cleanup, more exception handling. In other words, the organization postponed capability investment until after complexity had already multiplied. That is not efficient, it is just delayed spending under worse conditions, and because it arrives late, it is usually more expensive. This is the part leaders need to see very clearly. If you only fund delivery, you are not avoiding platform cost. You are converting it into structural debt. That debt shows up later as slower onboarding, more rework, more cleanup, more security effort, more support noise, and more distrust in the platform. It just no longer shows up under the original business case, so nobody feels directly responsible for it. That is how fragmentation gets financed, quietly, across multiple budgets, across separate teams, with no one owning the cumulative effect. From a system perspective, this is very predictable. The business unit funds the thing it can see. The platform team is expected to absorb the long tail. Security is expected to tighten controls later. Support is expected to handle the consequences. Architecture is expected to create order after expansion has already happened. That is not a scaling model. It is structural compensation funded by organizational separation. And once you notice that, a lot of transformation language starts sounding different. When leaders say, we need faster rollout, the real question is, are we also funding the decision model, governance capacity, support model, and operational boundaries that make faster rollout survivable? If not, then speed is being purchased by borrowing against future coherence. That is an expensive loan. So what changes this? Funding capability as first-class infrastructure, not as optional maturity work, not as a cleanup line item later. Upfront, that means allocating real budget to platform operations, lifecycle management, governance automation, environment strategy, enablement, and named ownership structures before rollout waves scale demand past local control. Because if those capabilities are underbuilt, every new success becomes harder to sustain than the one before it. This is why mature organizations stop asking only, what solution are we funding? They also ask, what operating capacity must exist for this solution to remain trustworthy when 10 more teams want it? That is a much better question. It ties money to business reality instead of pilot excitement. And it changes behavior fast, because once capability funding becomes explicit, the enterprise starts seeing scale as a portfolio problem, not a series of disconnected wins. Now, the conversation is not just about shipping another use case. It is about whether the estate is becoming more supportable, more governable, and more resilient as adoption grows. If the answer is no, then the organization is not underinvesting in IT. It is underinvesting in structural resilience. And once AI enters the picture, those weak funding assumptions do not stay manageable for very long. AI does not scale your system. It amplifies it. And this is why AI changes the conversation so fast. A lot of leaders still talk about copilot agents, automation, and low-code AI features as if they are a scaling shortcut. More output, faster answers, less manual work, quicker access to knowledge. That promise is real. But here's the thing, AI scales instantly. Your organization does not. That mismatch is where a lot of enterprise disappointment starts. Because when you add AI into Microsoft 365 and Power Platform, you are not dropping intelligence into a clean, stable operating model by default. You are connecting acceleration to whatever is already there. Good structure gets faster. Weak structure gets louder. Hidden mess becomes visible at machine speed. It's a system outcome. If permissions are inconsistent, AI will move through inconsistent permissions. If data lineage is weak, AI will generate output on top of weak lineage. If unlabeled content sits in places nobody has cleaned up, AI does not fix that. It increases the chance that someone interacts with it in a more consequential way. If shadow integrations exist, agents and automations can amplify dependency on them before anyone has mapped the risk properly. That is the executive truth. AI does not create coherence. It consumes whatever coherence already exists. And why is that so important in this context? Because everything we just covered gets multiplied under AI conditions. Workspace sprawl becomes retrieval sprawl. Ownership ambiguity becomes escalation ambiguity. Lineage weakness becomes answer distrust. Environment chaos becomes agent chaos. Hidden integrations become invisible automation chains that are now harder to reason about because outputs look polished even when the structure underneath is unstable. This is where a lot of Copilot programs stall. The first few weeks feel promising. People see quick wins. Drafting gets faster. Summaries look useful. Search feels smarter. And then the deeper enterprise questions arrive. Can we trust what this is surfacing? Can we explain why this person can see this answer? Can we prove where this information came from? Can we contain agent behavior inside known boundaries? Can we scale this without exposing old permission debt and unlabeled content at a much higher rate? That is usually the moment excitement meets business reality. And the reason this matters is simple. AI compresses the time between hidden weakness and visible consequence. Problems that stayed partly tolerable in manual environments become much less tolerable when AI can traverse, summarize, combine, and accelerate across them. A human workaround might stay local for months. An AI-enabled pattern can make the same weakness operationally relevant much faster. So if you are leading an enterprise rollout, do not ask only whether the model is capable. Ask whether the estate underneath it is structurally coherent enough to survive acceleration. That means permissions need to be reviewable. Data needs clearer ownership and source logic. Sensitive content needs better labeling and boundaries. Agent behavior needs observability. Service identities and connectors need stronger control. And exceptions need to be visible before they become automated pathways. Otherwise, AI value keeps getting framed as a tooling problem when it is really a systems readiness problem. This clicked for me when I started seeing AI less as a feature and more as a force multiplier. It multiplies speed, yes, but it also multiplies variance. It multiplies exposure. It multiplies the consequences of every unresolved operating inconsistency already living inside the tenant. So when leaders say we want AI to help us scale, I think the better translation is this. AI will help you scale whatever you have already built. If you have trust, it scales trust. If you have drift, it scales drift. If you have strong operating boundaries, it scales leverage. If you have weak ones, it scales uncertainty. That is why structural coherence matters more now, not less. And this is also why many AI programs feel surprisingly expensive before they feel transformative. The license is not the hard part. The hard part is everything the organization suddenly has to see clearly enough to trust. Permissions, lineage, labeling, ownership, policy enforcement, environment discipline. Those were already important. AI just removes the comfort of pretending they were optional. So no, AI does not scale your system. It reveals whether your system was built to scale in the first place. A practical enterprise scaling model. So before we close, let me make this practical in one model leaders can actually use. Not a maturity poster, not a transformation slogan, a working operating model you can audit. Start with a readiness review before you scale anything beyond the pilot. And keep it focused on 5 things. Ownership, decision flow, access, lineage, environment, logic. That is the minimum. Can you name who owns the process, the data, the solution, and the support path? Can you explain how routine decisions get made without pushing everything into escalation? Can you show how access is granted, reviewed, and removed? Can you trace where critical answers come from and which source is trusted? Can you explain why environments exist and how change moves across them? If those answers are vague, the organization is not ready to scale. It may still choose to scale. Many do. But it is scaling demand ahead of structural readiness. Then define enterprise principles before the rollout waves begin. Not after the first duplication problem, not after the first audit issue, before expansion. Decide what is fixed everywhere and what is flexible locally. Fixed usually means the things that protect trust. Ownership rules, lifecycle rules, authoritative data sources, access patterns, promotion paths, exception handling. Flexible usually means local workflow detail, language, sequencing, and context-specific process choices that do not break enterprise coherence. Make that distinction visible. Because if teams do not know what is fixed and what is flexible, they will invent the boundary themselves, and they will invent it differently. Then tie creation to lifecycle from day one. If a team, site, group, app, flow, or environment can be created, it should enter the estate with an owner, a purpose, a review path, and a renewal assumption attached to it. That one move reduces a huge amount of future cleanup because the organization stops treating lifecycle as a later administrative task and starts treating it as part of design. This is where a lot of scale stories either stabilize or drift. Next, assign named ownership for every critical asset class and every exception path, not shared awareness. Named ownership. Who decides when a production change is approved? Who owns a data definition conflict? Who resolves a support issue when the maker has left? Who signs off on a connector exception? Who is accountable when a workspace becomes orphaned? If the answer is a committee or everyone, or it depends, then the organization is still relying on informal memory. That does not scale. Then review system health monthly, not just adoption quarterly. That means looking at leading indicators that show whether the platform is stabilizing or fragmenting, rising duplication, rising private collaboration surfaces, rising manual reconciliation, rising exception traffic, rising dependency on key individuals or hidden connectors. Those are structural signals. If they are moving in the wrong direction, do not let a high usage graph distract you. The platform may be spreading while trust is eroding. And one more thing, use this model in funding conversations. Because if your readiness review shows weak ownership, weak lifecycle, weak observability, and overloaded platform operations, then the next smart investment may not be another solution rollout. It may be the capability layer that keeps the whole estate from degrading under success. That is not slowing progress. That is protecting future progress. So if I were reducing this to a leader's checklist, it would sound like this. Audit readiness before expansion. Define principles before replication. Build lifecycle into creation. Name ownership before incidents. Review health before celebrating adoption. Shift funding from visible delivery alone to structural capability as well. That is a practical scaling model, simple enough to use, hard enough to matter, And why does it work? Because it does not assume a good pilot will survive contact with enterprise reality on its own. It assumes scale changes the behavior of the whole environment. Therefore, the organization has to change what it designs around the solution. That is the real move. You are not asking, did the pilot work? You are asking, can the organization carry what worked without fragmenting underneath it? That is a much better question. And if you audited your scaling model the same way you audit your systems, what would you find? Would you find portable logic, named accountability, and repeatable trust? Or would you find local success sitting on top of invisible strain? Because the final test is not whether one team proved the idea. It is whether the enterprise can let that idea travel without rebuilding the same fragility everywhere it goes. So that is the takeaway. Scaling is not a growth problem first. It is a capacity problem. Good designs fail at enterprise scale when ownership, governance, lifecycle, and decision logic do not scale with them. So in your next rollout, do not ask what you can copy. Ask what must stay consistent for trust, speed, and value to survive across the whole estate. Start with one pilot. Audit its decision flow, ownership, access, lineage, and dependency load. Find one place where adoption is hiding fragility. Then shift one funding conversation from solution delivery to structural capability. Because you do not scale your organization by copying what worked once. You scale it by making sure what works can keep working everywhere. If you want more conversations like this, subscribe to the M365 FM podcast, leave a review, and connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn. Tell me where scale is breaking in your organization and what we should unpack next.